and welcome to episode 37 of Hardcore Gaming 101.net's Top 47,858 Games of All Time podcast, where we objectively, definitively, and scientifically rank the games you nominate on Twitter. Xerxes couldn't make it, as we've ordered him to cut down every tree in the forest. Every single one. I'm Carl, and my panelists today are...
I'm Bobinator.
I'm the Electric Viking.
And I'm Xerxes. I just finished cutting down those trees, you guys. I'm coming to you live via satellite link-up from the Gulf War.
On this podcast, we have 3 rules. Rule 1, all rankings are final, official, and scientifically accurate. Rule 2, you can nominate one game via a 5-star review on iTunes or Stitcher. We've stopped accepting nominations via Twitter for the foreseeable future. And Rule 3, you can nominate games that have already been nominated, just don't nominate games we've already ranked. You can see the master list yourself at bit.ly/47kgames. Our next game is Age of Empires 2, developed by Ensemble Studios, and it was published by Microsoft, back when published by Microsoft was actually kind of a good thing for PC games. It is an RTS, so it pretty much wasn't released on anything else, shockingly. I don't know, I think I heard
it was on PS2, believe it or not.
Really?
It got ported to the Nintendo DS at some point, with some modifications.
Yes, it's not the exact version. We definitely played the PC, though. Absolutely played the PC version. It was nominated by @neon_henchman and @Zarpaulus. It was earliest release date is September 30, 1999. And it is a RTS that is a follow-up to Age of Empires 1. And this is one of those famous games that I'm pretty sure most people, or at least the name Age of Empires, should trigger something in your mind if you're a person who plays games. Be like, yeah, there's a franchise called that, and I guess it does something.
I kind of feel like it's in kind of like the third place of RTSs compared to, say, Warcraft/StarCraft and Command & Conquer.
I think you're giving Command & Conquer too much credit in the present day. Command & Conquer really sort of tailed off. Kind of actually around this time, I think, around Age of Empires 2. I think maybe the double hit of sort of Age of Empires 2 and StarCraft really crimped the Command & Conquer franchise. That, and of course, EA bought the Westwood Studios and rammed that thing into the ground. They
really burned that one down.
Wow. I'd love to talk about that when we get to do a Command & Conquer related or a Westwood thing, but boy, does it feel like EA would just, I hate Westwood. Yeah. Buy them and destroy them.
See also Origin Studios.
That was a shame. But this is the Age of Empires 2. It is an RTS set in... It's not entirely, accurate, I don't think, but it's just kind of medieval period.
It's a pastiche of, let's say, from about 793 to the conquest of Constantinople period of history, with some definite hand-waving.
I do know a little bit of history, but not as clear, not as detailed as you have. The other thing is that this game just kind of arbitrarily, I believe Japan and China are in it, and they just use regular, weapons. And
they really hand-wave a couple... They do some things with the tech trees that I could get into about them that kind of acknowledge that they're a little different, but they definitely hand-wave some of the particularities of non-European cultures, let's say.
I think some Cibs, lose some technologies that others get. I think Japan doesn't get the wheelbarrow tech that lets you carry more stuff and move faster, so...
Yeah, the game does, it acknowledges by having a bunch of different civilizations, but they all kind of share the same vaguely Eurocentric thing, which is fine. That's the way this game is built. It works just fine. And of course, the game itself doesn't really care, because most of the levels you're going to play on are randomly generated hodgepodge maps. So Japan can be literally next to the British or something, so it doesn't really, it's just whatever. The Japanese race probably has samurai, and the other races have other things. I'm sure the British have longbowmen or something. I might get a little confused because there are several games like Age of Empires 2 that came out after this. Rise of Nations, Empire, Earth. There's a couple of others that kind of... They sort of blend together a little bit, but I think Age of Empires 2 might have been the first one in that sort of field because it was just following from Age of Empires. And Age of Empires was vaguely Roman, Egyptian themed, I think was roughly where that was.
So Age of Empires was very clearly attempting to ape certain elements of civilization while also grafting some of what you would say at that point were like command and conquer mechanics onto it. And even like, I can cite specific reviews at the time, but it was just seen as this kind of staid thing that didn't really have its own identity. Like Age of Empires 2, I think, succeeded far more, and I think, that
I think one of the big things
Okay.
About Age of Empires 2, to cut you off, sorry,
No.
is that it's about knights and dudes in armor and castles, and it's just such like an obvious thing, but it's just like, what do you want?
Evocative.
Like knights, and they get cannons and they hit things with swords, and it's like, cool, everyone likes that. Like, it's just such an easy sell. Like, you want to have swordsmen and stuff, and they break castles and attack things. Like, cool.
It's pretty dry compared to its competition. I mean, in like Warcraft, you guys make orcs have funny voices and they complain, click them a lot. Command & Conquer has the FMV of like this bald dude just hamming it up, and it's a very played straight, kind of dry game, Age of Empires.
So I can't argue with that a whole hell of a lot. I'm like the target audience for this in a lot of ways. I started playing this game when I was it came out when I was 11, so I was 11 or 12 when I got it for a Christmas. And
Boy,
this game
do 12-year-olds like people with swords.
This might have been the reason that I wound up getting a history degree in some weird way. This and Shogun Total War, which I played probably even more of at the time, and then wound up
Shogun Total War, very, very well done Total War.
Cannot wait to talk about Shogun Total War someday. And then I actually wound up playing, when they came out, Empire Earth and Rise of Nations. Not really an RTS fan, though. I like them as sort of pastiches of history and fiddling around with them in this kind of strange way.
Well, I think, like, piggybacking on Bob's point, this game is not for someone who thinks, boy, orcs and fantasy is awesome. No,
Absolutely
it's not for
not.
you. It is not. It's for people that like history, but are not the kind of people that like Clash of Steel.
Yeah.
Like,
I also think, similarly, it's also not necessarily for the StarCraft crowd, in the sense that StarCraft seems to move at a lot faster clip, and I think AoE 2 is a little more stately in its progression.
StarCraft is a game that you can, if you're playing pro level,
sure,
you can win or lose in 2 minutes.
Yeah.
It's just, it might take 5 minutes to realize you've lost, but if something goes wrong in the first 2 minutes, that's it, game over, GG.
And there are some gambits in AoE 2 that you can do, like the Teutons have a certain... There are some buffs that you can do where you can basically dump down a new town center next to an opponent's town center and just kind of eat them alive within like 5 minutes, but that's mostly a exploit against AI. But to kind of get into the things that make AoE 2 stick out, at least at its time, the tools baked into the game are actually sort of robust, I think. I think the game was fairly smart about stuff like when you cluster your units together, they tend to go into formations that make a certain logical sense without you having to micromanage constantly, which as a child was very helpful. So they'll tend to put your beefcakes up in front and kind of put your softer, lesser units kind of farther back. As you're throwing your groups of units at other units, they tend to target, like, weakest individual, or they tend to, do the rock, paper, scissors elements of those combats.
Are told to attack, they will actually kind of try and pick the counters that they're trying to take out, instead of your entire wave of crossbowmen attacking the speedy units they can't really hit or whatever.
I do appreciate that. It does make it a bit easier to get into. I do want to say that the difficulty level feels a little bit uneven at times. I've had times where I've just had games where I've been just trying to set myself up, just get my resources ready, and the AI just sends this unending army of guys I can never stop. But the one time I streamed the game with Cal, they just barely even fought back.
It's because I was there, and I totally helped you out there on how to play this one. No, it's always difficult to judge AI in a sort of an RTS game, because it generally will either lose because it can never beat a human on even ground, or it will completely destroy you because it cheats like crazy, because it's designed for someone who's incredibly pro and is just maximum tier at the game. So I try not to judge you, and the AI is competent. You can have quite a few AIs at once. You can have large levels filled with lots of AIs. That's fun. That's cool. It sort of suits itself. You can see the edges of the AI, but it's fine. You could play this game online. It was very popular online in its day, and you can still get a game going today because it was relaunched on Steam in like a HD update. So that's cool. You know, this game still has a fan base out there that like it. And
I never wound up playing like competitive matches online, but what I did wind up playing, and this was even into my early teens, I was still playing this game. People made so many stupid created lobbies for this game. I wound up playing several matches, and one is like a 13-year-old of like a remade, really crappy version of Helm's Deep, where it was like 2 or 3 players on a team inside of this giant fort with a king that they were guarding, and like 4 or 5 teams arrayed outside is just basically mobs of low-level units trying to go in and crash. Like, just ridiculous crap that it was kind of my introduction to stupid PC hackery and mods and bullshit. So, I don't know, I have a lot of sentimental crap tied into this game, unfortunately. But yeah, the scene around this game lasted for a pretty long time, and it ran pretty well over crappy internet, I will have to say. We probably did not have more than 56K growing up, and I never recall having any real connection problems.
That's one of the advantages of this kind of game, because this is not a micro-heavy game. StarCraft and the Warcraft 3 and, you know, that line of games, they're like super micro-heavy. You have units with a bunch of abilities that you got to activate all kind of at once at different times and all against different things, and you've got to manage all of your stuff. This game is definitely a little bit more macro. You just kind of set things in motion, and then when you finally decide to send an army in, you just kind of send an army in, and you just sort of kind of pull units around and do what you need to do. And it's not really, you know, it's more of a grand strategy than a kind of micro level strategy.
One thing, it does have kind of a slow pace. There's like so many different types of resources you just need to like slowly gather up and slowly upgrade your people until you think that you're good enough to actually fight, and that can take some time. So you do have to be pretty patient.
Yeah. And
it's not the slowest one around, though. You know, something like the Civilization games, obviously, because they're turn-based. This was much faster than those. This was just like, people want to play Civilization, but they don't have the 8 hours per game. Let's give them something faster. And that's what Age of Empires 2 was trying to... And Age of Empires 1, to an extent, was trying to pull off that.
And it's a great... It's a little sequel that no one really talks about, because... And, you know, even Rise of Nations, which was kind of, I think, to a lot of people, the real next step.
It is to me.
Age of Mythology being kind of this interesting spin-off. When they went with a sequel for that, they kind of went non-linear and made Rise of Legends afterwards.
Boy, was Rise of Legends just the hottest game to get around. Sorry, we're going to talk about a bunch of different RTSs, but...
Sure. Well, I mean, we haven't talked a lot about RTSs on here, so we give some sort of framework for them.
I'm glad that someone gave us an RTS to look at.
Particularly this one. Thank you very much.
But yeah, this genre burned itself out a little bit. Just people, I guess maybe this game just did it so well. It actually probably is closer to the Total War franchise just destroyed this kind of game. And I think because it sort of took the battle component and made the battle component more interesting to players, but also kind of kept this grand, like it gave a grand strategy closer to Civilization. That's the genius of, I think, the Total War games is they went, all right, well, people that want to play StarCraft are going to play StarCraft. People that want to play Civilization are trying to play Civilization. Let's do what we want to do and sort of cram it together in a way that actually works surprisingly well. Age of Empires wasn't trying to be StarCraft, but you have to actually want to play a real-time strategy game, which isn't always appealing to the same general audience that are looking for a historical game, because it fails to feel... The diplomacy in this game isn't good, and I think that's one of the things that that lets it down a little bit, because it just does kind of feel like an elimination game with a medieval sort of gloss of paint over it. Whereas something like Rise of Nations, which is one of my personal favorite RTSs, that game does actually have a lot of diplomacy going on. You can actually negotiate your way around. There's borders and all this cool stuff that makes Age of Empires, to me, seem a lot quainter, because it really does feel like a historical reskin.
One thing, there are ways to win without like just killing everybody, but it doesn't really feel like that's the most ideal thing to do. Yeah. It does feel a lot more focused on the combat, which I guess is fair for an RTS, but...
Yeah, so you can wind up there's actually a whole separate game mode of like there's this regicide, so you can have this like incredibly squishy character you wind up defending the entire time while you attempt to play an RTS around him. And then one of the other win conditions is basically you build this incredibly expensive item, a wonder that is unique to every civilization, which both of them are kind of turtling strategies in a different way that they aren't particularly fun. I mean, and
turtling is usually not fun for the people that are kind of trying to play against turtling, because it's just kind of you throw your soldiers against each other, and then it's like, okay, cool, just keep doing that until someone wins because they had more production. This game has walls. I want to mention that because this is, as far as RTSs go, this is one of the most sort of, it has walls that maybe actually do something. Almost every other RTS with walls are just, they're like paper walls that you don't really, you build them and then your enemy destroys them and it's like, well, that was a waste.
Yeah.
That was a big ass waste.
They're period appropriate pains in the asses, and eventually you'll develop siege weapons that'll work around it. So I think the tech tree in this, so it's an RTS game that actually has a pretty substantial tech tree for its time. That, as we mentioned, has certain elements lopped off as were deemed culturally appropriate by the folks who made this title. So there are basic kind of rock, paper, scissors decisions that are being made, but it's sort of rock, paper, scissors, but if you had about 37 different options that were stapled onto it, even down to like, so when your main base, which is kind of based around like a town center, gets invaded, early in the game you can ring a bell, which will draw in all of your random, like, what did you just call them, mooks, like villagers in, and they'll just start shooting at the invaders. And you can buff that ability over time up your tech tree, such that turtling in your town center is actually kind of a useful tool for like the first third of a game. And it makes you sort of like rush strategies kind of become a little more risky. Just like, there's like 1,000 other little steps like that. Up to one of my favorite things late in the game, you can pay a significant amount of money to turn individual enemy villagers in another town into spies. Or if you're playing the regicide version, that 200 gold will turn one of the enemy villagers into an assassin who will try to go and murder the other king. And you can counter that by basically just having a lot of villagers at any time, because then it becomes prohibitively expensive for someone to drop down like thousands of gold to, slowly go and convert all of your villagers into, turncoats or whatever, Benedict Arnold's. I don't know. I think this game holds up pretty well. It's clear, like, it's been outpaced. I think Rise of Nations really outpaced it, and that was, 13 years ago. I don't play a lot of RTSs, and I've kind of actually gotten out of strategy games in this way that kind of bums me out.
There hasn't been, like, RTSs as a genre have really done not well in the past 5 or 6 years. There's just been a severe dirge in them. And I don't think it's because, I think it's because people haven't really bought them. I don't know how many copies Grey Goo sold, but I don't think it did all that well.
Would you just say they've like been replaced with like MOBAs and such?
I think they have.
I think it's definitely a big component of it.
But I think that's a very real phenomenon. But I also think that StarCraft 2 is kind of the only real game in town in a way, isn't it? Anything else?
As I said, the only other game that came out that I know of that was a big name was Grey Goo. Like, that was the only other big RTS. I think they keep making Total War games, but they're kind of, again, a different genre in a way.
I just think they're so different, they don't even really count. Like, because they do have that grand strategy element that really differentiates them in a way. And, like, it's hand-wavy and not particularly well thought out, and hasn't been for a long time. I had a lot of problems with Rome 2. But, like, they're quite different. I just don't see them as even really comparable.
Yeah, like, I think
Company of Heroes, maybe Company of Heroes 2.
A lot of these games, I think people that like the RTS games, they like certain elements, and MOBAs deliver on those elements that they liked. And then the grand strategy people always prefer grand strategy games, so they just kind of shifted back to that kind of game. Yeah, it's like Endless Legends is very cool, but it's not, it's not delivering the same thing. Anyway, when we're talking about Age of Empires 2, and I guess we should try and rank this one.
I think so.
This is going to be tough, because we have, like, no reference points.
It will become the reference point, essentially. So the challenge with this one is Age of Empires 2 was quite popular in its day. It's quite popular to date. The catch with this one is I'm not really sure. Okay, StarCraft for it's impossible to ignore came out before this game.
Right.
Now StarCraft is undeniably a pretty big watershed of RTS games. Like you can't argue, I think, around that. It's a hugely influential, hugely important game, especially since they made one other StarCraft, and it was like.
Cool. I think people eventually stopped playing Age of Empires 2, but I don't think you can actually say that about original StarCraft even today. Like, I think it has slowly tailed off, but it's still played. So, it gets used a lot for things that are even loosely strategy on this list, and I feel dirty doing it because I just don't think they're really comparable. But Advance Wars 2, I think it is a better strategy-aligned game than Advance Wars 2 for certain. In terms of putting it much higher on this list, I think I'd put it above Super Mario Land.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's
I don't know
thing.
if
it is a very it's a pretty important game, but it was basically overridden by a lot of the games because a lot of RTSs in this period, when you were able to make games kind of bigger. Because this game wants to be bigger, and it can't be bigger because it's a 1999 game. StarCraft sort of sat and said, we don't really need to make this any bigger because we kind of perfectly built the game to fit the exact criteria of what we have. Whereas, grand strategy games were like, well, we want more units, we want more tech trees, we want more stuff on screen, we want more races and civilizations. We keep pumping them larger. So Age of Empires 2 is unfortunately this middle ground where it's better than Age of Empires 1, but there's a lot of games after it that were just like, well, but we're better. We're just going to come in there and make it better. I do think around that general vicinity, the Super Mario Land vicinity I think is pretty solid. I don't think I could put it above R-Type. It just feels just like
no. Yeah. I think I'm right there, honestly.
But one thing we got to keep in mind, just real quick, we got to think of somewhere to place it where we know where we can have buffer for any other RTSs we might get.
Oh, don't worry. I'd put Rise of Nations above a lot of things on this list.
Yeah. No, I think it's good. I do wonder if I would put it below Descent though, because Descent is kind of Descent is kind of a wholesale unique first-person weird flighty labyrinthian game. Age of Empires 2 feels like it's a transition point between a lot of games that it's just kind of we're the best show in town for the next year and a half or so. So get in, everyone, get in while we're still the best show in town.
It is an iteration, and Descent is certainly, full disclosure, I am 2 degrees removed from someone who made Descent, I discovered recently. Descent is more than three-dimensional Doom.
Yes,
really
that's an important part of the Descent game. I don't want to sell Age of Empires too short, but pushing it a lot higher would be very difficult.
Oh yeah, no, I don't think it's. I'm going to save my ammo for a couple other games of this ilk, which I'm pleased to discover. I'll have at least one person on my side.
So
I could live with it below Descent.
Okay,
you have a strong opinion about this?
I think below Descent is pretty good. I think it's a worthwhile game. It's just being overshadowed by games that are going to get put higher than it,
Absolutely.
And it's always tricky for us to place these things that we know that it's gonna get other things. But I guess because Age of Empires 2 especially, it does feel like a stopgap, and it feels like a lot of other games would come along and really try and work its own formula better. Even if it was something like Age of Mythology, which takes Age of Empires and then kind of adds all these twists and mechanics to it and extra stuff. It's wow, you really cranked out your own ideas. You've carved your own game in here that I can really get the feel for. Age of Empires just feels you took Civilization and you made it real time, and that's really cool, and it's probably better than Call to Power, which doesn't work all that well in a lot of ways. It doesn't have a great single player. I know that's not the best criticism when it comes to an RTS, but a lot of RTSs at this time did try. They were we'll put a good story mode in and we'll do our best. And Age of Empires is very much, no, get online, get your 56K modem and go online, because
there are some campaigns baked in, and they're passable.
The sort of limitations in terms of civilizations. I do like that all the civilizations, I think they have different building types. Like, they look different.
Yeah,
I know
so there's like 4 different skins. The really cool thing is that every civilization has their own language track. So even as a child, I knew how to say, basically, I'm a lumberjack in what amounts to, like, Icelandic. It's Timborofandi.
Like, that's cool stuff, and I appreciate it. But Below Descent is cool with me, and so that's where it'll be.
If you're a fan of something, you don't have to make an entire game about it. You can help other people do it by going on patreon.com/HG101 and helping us make this podcast by giving us a small monthly donation. For some reason, like when my favorite podcast, which provides me with over 4 hours of brand new content each month, asks me to chip in something like $3, $5 a month, I immediately think, I don't have that kind of money. I can enjoy podcasts for free, therefore any money I spend on them is money wasted, right? But then I had this great experience of meeting one of my favorite podcast hosts in person. This was about maybe a year and a half ago. And afterwards, I realized that although I just bought the guy a couple beers without hesitation, I hadn't been willing to donate anything to his Patreon to help him just pay his bills and keep the show on the air. So because of that, I, immediately after that, just having met him in person made me realize that I should be contributing just a little bit of something. And it feels good. I can't afford to donate money to every podcast I listen to because I listen to a lot of them, as you probably guessed. But there are a few shows that I really look forward to each week because they feel like they were just kind of like made just for me. And for those shows, I try to kick back a couple bucks their way each month through Patreon because I know that if I met those people in person, I'd feel guilty about having not chipped in. If the Top 47K Games show is one of those shows for you, if you'd really miss us if we suddenly disappeared, you should consider going to patreon.com/HG101 and sign up to donate a few bucks a month. You'll feel good and you will help us out and you'll get some cool stuff on top of that. In fact, any amount you give gives you access to ad-free versions of this show, plus an exclusive bonus segment every now and then. And at the $5 a month pledge level, you'll get PDF copies of the 3 most recent HG101 books, which I believe right now includes like a Taito book. And you'll get PDFs of all upcoming books when they're released for as long as you're a subscriber. So something to think about, food for thought. Now back to the show.
Our next game is Panzer Dragoon Saga, developed by Team Andromeda and published by Sega. Although I think Team Andromeda is basically a Sega team, so that kind of... Basically, Sega here. It was released on the Sega Saturn, but you probably know that because it's the most famous Saturn game pretty much ever released. It was nominated to us by @Canenzo and Mindbender333, and Mindbender was iTunes. Its earliest release date and territory was January 29th, 1998 in Japan. It saw a very, very limited Western release that I've read is basically only 20,000 copies spread out across English-speaking territories, and they were subtitled in English rather than translated with voice actors, which is very uncommon for a game of its time. Very cool stuff. And to help us out on this one is the Gunheart, who also played through this one. Panzer Dragoon Saga. What does anyone think about this one?
Okay,
this game really freaking rocks.
Yeah, I just want to come in hot right now. This game is better than FF7, and I'm not sorry.
One thing is that amazed me still is that it had a serious uphill battle. And right from the get-go, it's a role-playing game based on 2 railway shooters. And second, it has the honor of having had 4 discs worth of story to a game series that's plot is usually limited to the intro and ending.
Although the previous Panzer Dragoon games did infer a really interesting world, which it was one of the reasons those games were popular, at least in the sense that when you looked at them, when you played them, you're like, wow, this seems like a really cool sense of place and universe. And so when Sega released Saga and they're just like, and now there's actual plot, it's like, wow, I can actually learn about the world that these games took place in, although I don't know if they're strictly kind of slightly retconned, because I'm not quite sure how they all fit together. Do they fit together perfectly? I don't think they do.
I can't quite remember the exact details, but the timeline goes the second game, the first game, and Saga. In fact, Saga even has it actually has the airship that you're chasing in the second Panzer Dragoon. And it still has the wings blown off of it that you blew up in Panzer Dragoon 2.
I do understand that the dragon is different but same, and it's like reincarnated or something between the games. As far as the plot goes, it's very curious sort of character, because the games don't feature the same characters, correct? This has a whole new cast.
It's a new idol every game.
So does anyone want to throw at me the plot? Because we mentioned the Empire. You play as a fairly bland guy who is deliberately bland because he's just kind of like the main character, and he's kind of you in the game world.
Basically, in this one, plotline is that it's the post-apocalypse. An evil empire is digging up ancient artifacts from before the apocalypse, etc. Okay, it's been a while since I've actually played the first two.
I can try to explain the plot of this game if you want.
Go for it.
So basically, you're this bland guy named Edge. That's the default name anyway. I don't think you can change it.
I love that your name's Edge. That's such a stupid name.
It's not that edgy, so...
It's funnily enough, the first one, actually, in the first game's protagonist was actually named Kyle. I mean, that just sounds so out of place given the art direction to have such a normal name.
Right, because this game has this really bizarre feature where they invented a whole language to use in the opening cutscene and then switched back to Japanese for the rest of the game, which is bizarre. Panzer Dragoonese, I think, is the made-up language that's in the opening cutscene, but for the rest of it, it's not.
Anyway, to recap the intro real quick, so these Empire guys show up at the mine Edge is guarding. They kill all his friends there, and Edge falls into like a disused mine shaft where he finds this dragon, and so he and the dragon bond, and they go off to basically just fight the Empire.
But there's a lot more to it with this game, right? Because there's a lady that's in stone.
A little bit off because you're not fighting the Empire at the start. You're fighting a rogue element of the Empire. You're actually working for the Empire at the start of the game. You're a mercenary hired to guard one of their, what is it?
Yeah, it's one of their mining sites.
Their excavation sites. So they excavate the technology from the old world.
One thing I really like, it feels like the plot is much more condensed and it goes by much more quickly than most other RPGs of the time. Like, a lot of the most really important stuff, it's all FMV cutscenes, and those are pretty
There's a lot of FMV cutscenes in this game.
And everything else, like all the world building, it just comes like one big chunk that you're just free to skip entirely if you so choose. So it's a very fast-paced story, and I do appreciate that a lot.
It does slow down a bit in Disc 2, though, where, for one, there are a ton of side quests you can easily miss because they require talking to the NPCs over and over long after their dialogue has started looping. And they introduce a town that you can explore, and the most plot-relevant NPC is on the opposite corner of the starting point after a really long, space-filling path with no shortcuts.
So you were saying the game gets a lot worse after the first disc, right?
I wouldn't say it gets worse, it's just that it introduces one element that slows things down quite a bit.
And I guess we should probably explain that this game is not a typical JRPG. The way the game is laid out, the way that the mechanics work, this is very unusual. Your main form of traversal is you actually fly around on the dragon, and you go through your areas flying around on the dragon. Somewhat similar to the original Panzer Dragoon titles, you can lock onto things, but instead of it being enemies in this case, it's actually just items and objects of interest.
The environments in this game are pretty boring. There's no real dungeons or anything. It's basically just like...
That only really applies to the first disc. The areas get more elaborate as the game progresses.
Oh, I was not aware of that. I only really played the end of the first disc, so...
Shh. So, this game, it has you flying around on the dragon, and it gets increasingly complicated, but there's also a town mode, which takes a much more normal JRPG sort of approach. You walk around towns. The difference in this game is, unlike Final Fantasy VII and a lot of other JRPGs, Sega, even though the whole game is full of rendered FMVs, they made pretty much the whole actual real-time game is 3D. Like, everything is just real-time 3D. Kind of dicey to attempt on the Saturn, and they pulled it off pretty well because they used pretty much every trick that Sega had figured out for the Saturn to date. And it had a long development time. This game was started development in 96 and only came out in 98, so it's a pretty long tail on this one.
Also unusual is the fact that even on foot you use the lock-on cursor to interact with things, which kind of gives it a bit of a point-and-click feel.
When you aren't wandering around and sort of talking to NPCs repeatedly to trigger conversations, that's a weird one. You fight things in the random-generated battle system, which is kind of unique because, firstly, the grinding in this game is kind of deliberately guided. There's not an unlimited amount of enemies. You just gradually run out of enemies in an area, so the game doesn't really let you grind to indefinitely, which is really cool. And the actual battle system is a translation of the Panzer Dragoon previous games into an real-time sort of RPG format, which is really cool.
The interesting thing is that kind of inverts how Panzer Dragoon's battles normally work, where enemies surround you and you aim at them, and that you flank around your enemies here.
May I talk about the battle systems? I actually really do like this game's battle system.
Sure.
Okay, well, it's kind of an active turn-based kind of thing. You've got 3 meters, and for each one that fills up slowly over time, you get 1 action. You can use your dragon to launch a homing attack that hits multiple enemies. You can use your laser gun to hit 1 enemy. But the really cool thing is that you can actually rotate around the enemies, and enemies do have different attacks and patterns depending on where you are in position to them. So you have to constantly stay moving and just pay attention to where the enemies are moving, and it really makes you actually think about what you're doing, not just fight, item, magic, fight, item.
And it's important because the enemies do have weak points that you can only hit from certain angles. So you're maneuvering around them, they're maneuvering around you, and you're trying to hit their weak points but stay out of their more powerful attack areas. And there's a very cool rhythm to this pseudo real-time thing. And to make it slightly more, so you do have a whole host of spells. The downside, and I think this was the downside that people looked at the time as well, it doesn't have a party system, really. You are just your dude, Mr. Edge, and the dragon, and he's riding the dragon, so you basically have one character at any one time. There's no extra party members, which is a little bit of surprise, but makes the game feel unique and different.
There are some NPCs that will ride along with you, but none of them have any gameplay consequence.
But I don't mind the single party thing so much because it makes fights go a lot faster. Fights do tend to go pretty fast in this game, especially if there's a weak point you can just hit the enemy with and they just die. I love that.
That said, I do admit I'm a little disappointed at the magic system, since more often than not I find that just the homing laser or gun will take care of anything that you without you having to spend your magic points on, which you can instead use to heal. Oh, another thing worth noting is that after the second main field area, you gain the ability to allocate your dragon's abilities in one of 4 different categories. And the cool thing is that this isn't a permanent change, irreversible change. You can change out the dragon and your dragon's stats even during battle, and it even comes with this cool real-time morphing effect. So, if you would switch to attack, and if you would put more points in attack, the dragon's horn will lengthen and the claws will get sharper. If you would switch to the fins, it will get this hammerhead helmet, the tail gets more armored, etc.
Do you think that enhances the game's replay value, or is it more of a fun gimmick? Because I don't know how often you'd have replayed this game. It's not the longest game, though. It's much shorter.
It's not really much of a replay mechanic because, again, you're not encouraged to stay in any one form. For example, there are some enemies that are, say, immune to lasers, so since the attack mode only affects your dragon's lasers, it's pointless to stay in that mode. And also interestingly is that you can actually max out 2 of the dragon's abilities at any given time, at the cost of drastically reducing 2 other stats. So, like, attack is opposite of your magic, speed is opposite of your defense, and...
It's a really, really, like, cool way to approach a RPG battle system that's not the same. Like, they really went, okay, you got the dragon, and you're just going to have the dragon, so we need to really work this and make something interesting. And I think they succeeded on that one. They definitely made this game feel completely different. And it also helps because the game world is thoroughly interesting. You know, it's, as Jeff had mentioned, this game is a post-apocalyptic game, so it feels kind of interesting compared to a lot of other JRPGs which don't actually take place kind of post-apocalyptic.
One thing I think that's interesting to note about the post-apocalyptic setting is the fact that even the pre-disaster world is incredibly alien-looking. I mean, this game could easily take place on some Star Wars alien planet, and you'd probably never know.
Yeah, that's really... They built a really interesting world for Panzer Dragoon and Panzer Dragoon Saga, but a lot of it is hard to communicate, I think, especially in the real-time 3D. You can see the concept art for this game. Its follow-up, kinda, Panzer Dragoon Order has a lot more realization of the world that they might have been kind of looking for. So I guess that's kind of like a strength and a weakness, that it does have this idea of a really grandiose, unique, sort of sci-fi apocalypse fantasy world. Something that maybe someone like Mobius might have penned, but a little bit of it doesn't come through because, you know, it's running 3D on the Saturn. There's only so much that it can give you.
Though I do have to, again, give props to the art direction for repeating some motifs. It really communicates on aspects. Like, you can easily tell what sort of the ancient technology and such are by the use of that creepy sterile white and the black color scheme, or the way the Empire's technology all has aspects of the ancient world's tech, but typically in this scavenger world look bolted onto it.
I think it's really, like, it's a very well realized sort of environment and world, which is really cool looking stuff. I think we should probably move on to trying to place this game somewhere in our list. Does anyone have anything else to add before we do that?
It would be somewhat remiss not to mention the ridiculous aftermarket value of Panzer Dragoon Saga. And I thought you were going to mention the music, because the music's pretty good. The music's pretty good. I honestly don't think it's as good a soundtrack as the original Panzer Dragoon, but it's actually quite good.
I have to agree on that. The only other issue I'd also have is that it is incredibly easy. I mean, while you do have to pay attention in every battle, you can't just smash one button and get through everything. It's still... And if you are paying attention, it's almost impossible to die.
Almost all 3 Saturn Panzer Dragoon games seem to suffer from being too easy. I feel like they wanted you to finish them.
Old as hell.
You think so? I thought they were short and not particularly hard, especially compared to other sort of shmups and things at the time, which were kind of always...
I know I could beat Stormfront 64 pretty much blindfolded, but I could barely get through either of the first 2 Panzer Dragoons.
It feels like it's harder to dodge things in Panzer Dragoon.
Yeah, that's the big thing.
You just got to get used to not being able to move. Yes.
To give an idea for a ranking, I'm thinking like between Robotron and Drill Dozer.
I would just caution you guys about, like, just because it's super rare and it's pretty good, being a pretty good game that's super rare isn't necessarily like a perfect game. But I don't think that's where you guys were going anyway, so that's okay.
No, the rarity of this game helps to make it evoke a sort of mythical status and
kind of thing, basically.
And it's all because the Saturn itself as a system was kind of on no one's radar, and then the a few dozen people that actually owned one were like, yeah, but a Radiant Silvergun is like the best shmup ever, and Panzer Dragoon is like the best RPG ever. And it's like, okay, guys, cool. That's great. I'm sure that's why the Saturn sold just hundreds of thousands of millions of dollars worth.
Just for the sake of argument and for the sake of our listeners' wallets, although I would recommend this game if there's a way you can find to play it that's not, that's more or less tolerable. It probably is cheaper to buy I would say probably a Japanese Saturn or any Saturn maybe, and then mod it than it is to buy this game.
So they did managed to get the Saturn CD drive to accept different kinds of discs now, didn't they?
Yes, you can pirate games on your Saturn if you tool around with it in a particular fashion. It's not usually recommended because the laser and the track tend to work a bit too hard. It's a problem that CD drives have, especially ones of the Saturn's kind of period vintage, where it struggles to read burnt CDs, and if you throw a burnt CD in it, it's like it can read it, but it works extra hard, which is a death sentence for this sort of thing. But you can emulate this game 100%. We'll go into details a little bit because, you can emulate it. You have to use the European, PAL version because disc swapping on the best emulator you can get for the Saturn, which is, Bob?
That would be either Medithin, or if you like RetroArch, you can use Medithin's core there.
And if you can actually use disc swapping with the PAL version, and you can actually get it running, and you can actually play the game all the way through without spending whatever $1 billion you have to do.
Do not use the American version because for some reason disc 2 through 4 are not recognized as game CDs on that emulator for some reason.
That's phenomenal.
For those of you who are considering perhaps buying the Japanese version, which is readily available in the Seattle area for around $30, and playing it in a US Saturn for some reason, which I was considering doing and just looking at, YouTube clips or just a physical script on paper. Apparently, Action Replay's 4M Plus, the kind of standard cart people slap in there for playing import games, kind of freaks out on multi-disc Japanese games, of which I don't know if there are a whole hell of a lot of, and Panzer Dragoon Saga is one of them. So that's actually not a viable route either.
When we look at Final Fantasy VII here, and the only reason I'm going to start at Final Fantasy VII is Panzer Dragoon Saga is pretty much held up as the gold standard of RPGs on the Saturn. There's very few that you could argue are better, and contemporary-wise, a lot of people at the time were, if you had a Saturn, you were like, Panzer Dragoon Saga, it's at least as good as Final Fantasy VII. That was the game that they would throw at Final Fantasy VII every time someone was like, that kind of thing. So, compared to Final Fantasy VII, what are we sort of looking at with Panzer Dragoon Saga?
I'm thinking between Robotron and Drill Dozer.
I would actually go so far as between Wario Land 4 and Galaga.
I'm okay with that.
I want to hear from Xerxes because he's sitting there trying to twiddling his thumbs.
I've not even really played this, so I don't have a lot of skin in this game, but I don't know if I can give you Robotron and Galaga. I just don't know, man.
Yeah, I don't know about that either. I don't.
Don't tell them that you haven't played it. That's really dangerous.
I'm just going to be straight.
I'm going to not rank this, but
I have an opinion. I'm not ranking it.
No. Okay, so my opinion in terms of this is Final Fantasy VII is probably, and I think we may have said this, but I think it was the most important JRPG of 1997. I don't think you can fight that point, in terms of longevity, in terms of impact.
It's a very influential, important game. I won't deny that.
I will say this much. The one thing about kind of going for and against Panzer Dragoon Saga is that there was nothing like it before it came out, and really nothing like it since.
That's true.
That's one of my real questions, because what I was thinking was Panzer Dragoon Saga, you can't really... It's never been stolen wholesale, It was a difficult game to sort of create, because they spent basically, I think, a year converting Panzer Dragoon into an RPG, and they did a surprisingly good job. That was something I read from an interview with the designers where they were like, okay, we really struggled to make Panzer Dragoon an RPG, but once we got there, then we made the rest of the game, and it does actually show that they spent a lot of effort on it.
Yeah, I'll say one of the biggest circles on our kind of grid or diagram of rating criteria that we almost never refer to
I think it's because that has a big circle that says, does Xerxes like it, as one of the main criteria. So,
no, it is actually Xerxes played it when he was a kid, therefore it's good.
Right. Yes.
Yeah. No, I mean it's the big, but even bigger than that circle, Cal.
Yes.
If you must know.
I know.
Is
I know.
one of a kind in a good way.
I think it is one of a kind in a good way. I think that you can't even argue against that.
But I can't in good conscience put it above Final Fantasy VII, even though I think it is mechanically a much more fun JRPG, or like that's the one I would play again. But like the impact that Final Fantasy VII had artistically and otherwise on games since then is staggering.
You can't overestimate it, because we're still feeling Final Fantasy VII today. But
we're still making Final Fantasy VII today. It just keeps happening
Dragoon Saga, because Sega hate money. They just have this ability to take money and lose it. You know, today, like, they still haven't been able to port it. They lost the source code, or someone stole it, or they deleted it, or whatever they did. I don't know. They just went.
Well, it should be noted, some people involved in the making of this game died, if I'm not mistaken, during the process of making it.
Yes.
Two members of the dev team died during the production of this game, and one of them one of them may have killed themselves over stress. I don't know if you want to include that in here, but that's apparently the designer or lead really took this personally. Like, it's like, yeah, no, the pressure of this game was destroying my team when we were making it. Like, the other guy I think died in a motorcycle accident, but whether that's connected or not sure.
One thing, I am kind of sad that more games have not been inspired by this game, because I feel like I would have more respect for the genre if they did. Because
I have to draw out one tangent. This is probably the most accurate representation of how a mecha anime battle would probably work in the RPG battle system I've ever seen, and it's a shame that none of the Xeno games ever bothered to replicate it.
It's kind of like the end of Star Trek II: Wrath of Khan, right, where Kirk outsmarts his enemy because his enemy's from the 21st century and doesn't understand that like spaceship combat functions in 3 dimensions.
Yeah,
I mean, it just manages to recreate that feeling of a high-speed aerial battle. I don't know
if we got properly into that.
Class or some of the Gundam series.
That unlike like most the Final Fantasy VII as an immediate example, most of those battles are pretty much we're standing here and then we hit each other. Whereas some of the battles in Panzer Dragoon, it's like vehicles flying around and the background's whooshing past you and you're swerving shots. And it's really cool. And I think companies, and I think Squaresoft did it, and we looked at it, the games where you actually do target limbs and you have like that sort of, that system is found in Panzer Dragoon Saga. They sort of did
the Vagrant
this.
Story, yeah.
Yeah, Vagrant Story did that. There are other ones that
okay, so my final offer here, between Alien Soldier and Streets of Rage 2, because right above Alien Soldier is Alien Soldier is Alien Soldier, which is, I think... but right above that is Kix, Final Fantasy VII, Metroid.
Yeah, well, I think the question is, I think it is an important one, is, is Panzer Dragoon Saga as a game, because it didn't influence almost anything, I don't think, and that's probably because it sold like half a dozen copies, and that's because they only made that many, but it's just like, there are some issues with it that are kind of rough-edged that we did mention, and it hasn't aged super great in places. The FMVs, unfortunately, kind of aged the game more than you would think, because they kind of look really silly.
They actually look, man, despite the fact that they have more expressive faces than, say, Final Fantasy VIII, which came out the same year, the FMVs actually managed to look worse than the one at the start of the first Panzer Dragoon.
They did the lighting really not great. I think it's because they rendered so many of these that they just didn't have time to do the amount of passes that you would do on a like a 10-second, 1-minute intro. They had to just churn these things out, and it didn't work in their favor. Okay, so Alien Soldier, I know some of you guys want to push this one higher. I don't know. I like Saga quite a lot, but its influence has not reverberated through games in any sort of conceivable fashion. Also, I'm kind of bothered that Sega just dumped this one and never really. They did Orata, but
Well, the curse. Don't forget the curse.
Yeah, the curse. So
you would be afraid to touch it too.
I mean, just the brain drain alone from that. Like, that studio didn't do a whole hell of a lot else after this, really. Like, it's kind of
Andromeda was disbanded, and then they partially became Small Byte, and then I don't know what Small Byte did after.
Okay.
Yeah. between
Final Fantasy VII and Kix. No, or between Kix and Alien Soldier. How about that?
That's too low. I'm sorry.
It's got to be underneath Kix. It's got to be underneath Kix.
It's underneath Kix.
Kix is Kix.
Okay, between Metroid and Final Fantasy, final offer.
Bob really, really prefers this over Final Fantasy VII, and that's, I can understand that. They're kind of so distinctly separate. One, like, Final Fantasy VII is kind of beaten down by virtue of the fact that it has been reused and reformatted something like 1,000 times.
It's got a real big target on it.
But on that note, people don't look to Panzer Dragoon Saga and say, all right, I really want to do this game again, even though they should, but they don't. Final Fantasy VII has this thing that was kind of like, okay, we figured it out, we did it. Everyone's just going to take this game and keep making this game. I do think that Panzer Dragoon Saga, if you were to remake this game as Final Fantasy VII is getting a remake, it would probably be better, I think. Like, I really think if you were to remake this game, you could kick the shit out of Final Fantasy VII.
It is, like, from a gameplay standpoint, better and more fun than Final Fantasy VII. I'm just saying Final Fantasy VII is like, it's just too... this is coming from somebody who does not really like Final Fantasy VII. I like things about it a lot more than I like the game itself.
I think Final Fantasy VII is probably sitting slightly more accessible. Panzer Dragoon Saga is a little bit trickier to get into, I mean, that's a good thing and a bad thing, but
what makes a JRPG is telling a story, is presenting memorable characters, telling a story artistically. It's not just the battle system. The battle system in Final Fantasy VII is passable, but there's other things that this genre does normally.
I do think that
that's fair.
While they tried so hard to, and they succeeded and told a very nice, very sort of condensed, and also a slightly personal story with Saga. I can't remember anyone in this game. I mean, they look good sometimes, but
I'm okay with below Quicks. I Kix.
I don't dispute the case.
Well, I don't really see why it gets kicked below Kix, but if that's what we're doing, that's what we're doing.
Kix is Kix. It is.
You keep saying that, but Kix is not.
It's the game that launched 1,000 clones.
We don't even remember what we said about Kix.
Yeah,
fair.
Fortix.
I do.
I know it's Kix. It's what? All right, fine. Just put it below Kix. I don't mind. Kix inspired a whole range of strip porno games. So fine.
Exactly.
Kix can stay there. Whatever.
Case in point.
That's all for this episode of Hardcore Gaming 101's Top Games Podcast. Special thanks goes out to @Neon_Henchman, @Zarpaulus, @Aminion Chorion. I'm never gonna get that one right. @Canendedzo and Mindbender333 on iTunes for nominating these games. And thanks to those of you who we didn't get to yet, we will be getting to you soon. Thanks as well to my lovely co-hosts and our co-patriots, our editor Jeff Rood, our theme song composer Muteki, and of course, the support and feedback of listeners like you. You can support this podcast by making a small monthly donation at patreon.com/HG101, by subscribing to the HG101 YouTube channel, and by following @GC9X and @HG_101 on Twitter. But most importantly, Help us claw our way into podcasting firmament by getting on iTunes, subscribing to HG101, and giving us a 5-star review. Do it, or we'll require more food to research the better podcast tech. Until next week, keep keeping it real. Should I be using your catchphrase? That seems like theft.
Nah, I think it's okay.